Sejam bem-vindos ao podcast Physio Frontiers. Essa é uma série especial do portal Fisiortopedia em parceria com a base de dados Pedro Brasil.
O objetivo desse podcast é contribuir para aproximar pesquisa e prática clínica em diferentes contextos, quebrando barreiras linguísticas e trazendo convidados internacionais que fazem a diferença na área.
Eu sou o Bruno Saragiotto.
E eu sou Tia Yamato.
E juntos nós iremos te guiar nessa jornada pelo mundo.
Prepare-se
e vem com a gente!
Fala pessoal, estamos de volta no Physio Frontiers. É quase que uma segunda temporada agora. A gente teve um pequeno break, mas a gente já está de volta com o podcast. Tem um monte de episódio que a gente está gravando. E o episódio de hoje a gente teve a Rana Heeman. A Rana Heeman, ela é uma professora da Universidade de Melbourne. Ela eu acho que é uma das maiores entidades em pesquisa em osteoartrite. Tem uma carreira clínica também. Então acho que a maioria da pesquisa relacionada à fisioterapia e osteoartrite veio dela ou do grupo dela. Então a gente conversou bastante sobre isso, a gente conversou dos avanços da área, um pouquinho sobre a carreira dela, né, como ela começou, por que ela escolheu o físio, né, os conselhos que ela poderia dar para um jovem pesquisador, para um clínico, e um pouquinho sobre prática baseada em evidência na área de osteoartrite também, e treinamento, né, de fisioterapeutas. Então foi um papo muito legal, espero que vocês gostem, e I'll see you soon.
Hello, we are back with the Physio Frontiers podcast after a few months of a break. And today we are delighted to have Professor Rana Heeman with us. So Rana is a professor at the University of Melbourne in Australia. And she does a lot of research on musculoskeletal health, especially osteoarthritis of the hip and knee, and telehealth as well. So welcome, Rana. Welcome to our podcast.
Thanks very much for having me. It's great to be here.
Awesome.
Hi, Rana, and welcome. So I would like to start traveling a bit to the past to know what inspired you to become a physiotherapist in the first place. Could you share the story behind your decision to pursue this profession?
Sure. Taking me back in the past a little bit, but I guess I've always had an interest in the sciences, and that was always through my schooling and secondary schooling. So all the sorts of subjects I did were science-based, and particularly I really liked all aspects of sort of biology and learning about the human body.
Right.
So I always had that interest, and it just seemed when I was thinking about what I was going to do after finishing school, I wanted to do something that I wanted to go to uni and come out with a degree that I could do something with, like I could get a job. Doing a broad-based science degree felt a bit open-ended to me. Maybe it's probably really because I was quite naive back then and didn't know where it could take me. And so the really tangible aspects of being a physiotherapist and being able to work as a physiotherapist in doing the things that I liked and using my brain in the way that I liked really appealed to me. So that was really how I ended up on that path.
That's nice. And how did research come to your life? Like, I think you practiced, you did some clinical work first. What motivated you to?
It's a really interesting question because if I think back to my years at university, and so I did my bachelor degree at the University of Melbourne, that was back in the 90s. I don't think I was unusual, but I hated research. We had to do research and research subjects across the 4 years of our degree, and I could not wait to be done with that subject. But really, interestingly, once I went out into clinical practice and went into the area that interested me, which was musculoskeletal health, and I worked in a public hospital, was where I spent most of my clinical time and solely in the musculoskeletal space, apart from my first year. And it was only when I was doing clinical work that I actually really started to question a lot of what I'd been taught at university. And I think the time that I went to uni was in the 90s. And, the whole concept of evidence-based practice wasn't a really big thing in physiotherapy degrees or in physio back then. And so even though we did those subjects that I talked about with research, they were really statistically based. So it was like learning about ANOVAs and this, that, and the other. And that whole concept of evidence-based practice. In fact, I don't even think the Cochrane collaboration had formed when I started my, physiotherapy degree. And so I'd kind of been taught, you do this manual technique and do that. And I got out and I just started thinking, I'm not sure, is this even working? What's the proof that, I'm mobilizing this ankle joint, and what's it doing? Is it doing anything? Would the patient just get better if I see them in 4 weeks without doing this? And I started to get a bit disillusioned with clinical practice and thought, I need to do something else. And at that point, I started thinking about research, and I didn't even know where to start. So I just really went back to the university and went, hey, I'm thinking about maybe doing something else. What would that involve and what would that look like? And it was really just opportunity that someone said, well, you should think about this and you could apply for a scholarship. And before I knew it, I was enrolled in a PhD. And I never would have thought that would have happened 4 years earlier when I graduated with my, my physiotherapy degree.
It's nice. Yeah. And that's probably the case of lots of physios. They are in praxis and they just have questions and don't know where to go. Yeah. For me, it was a little bit different because I had evidence-based practice, and then I thought was fascinated research, and then I decided. But it's very interesting. You have your questions from your clinical work. Yeah. And Rana, then moving to your research. So you have made a lot of contributions, a very significant contribution to the osteoarthritis field. Especially the osteoarthritis. And you work with a wide range of interventions. I know you have papers on the biomechanics of OA, papers testing insoles, taping, passive interventions, exercise interventions, more recent papers on telehealth and implementation science. So that's definitely a lot of research through the years. But my question is, with all of this research and you being an expert, do we know how to be successful with those OA patients? Like, do you know what to do today?
Look, it's a good question. And I think you've got me thinking about, how my research career has evolved. And I think I've been working in osteoarthritis since I did my PhD. So that's what I did. And if I think back to what the research field was like when I started my PhD, and thinking about writing the literature review of my, my thesis, lots of papers back then that were about physiotherapy were actually just about electrotherapy. It was applying this passive intervention and that. A lot of the study designs were really poor, lots of big claims talked about from different studies that weren't clinical trials, and basically doing lots of passive interventions back then. And, we did some of those as well. And I think over time, as the evidence has built and we've started to see more and more evidence that, passive interventions aren't really that effective, or if they do anything, they only have a very, short-term transient effect. And this whole shift in the way that we think about osteoarthritis is really not just a condition of the knee joint where we must do something, that very biomedical approach to doing something to the patient, but thinking about it as a long-term condition and helping someone to live with it. I think that's probably really how my thinking and our research has really shifted over the years. And I think what the current research tells us is that there's no magic bullet for osteoarthritis, which can be a really hard information for a patient to receive, but I think also really hard information for clinicians out there in clinical practice to accept as well. But I think once you accept that and work with what we do know, because we do have lots of evidence about things that can help in a range of small ways, and if we put that together, well, that can really help empower a patient to live better with osteoarthritis and not let it take over their life. So I guess, my research path has really shifted. As you said, Bruno, I did used to do a lot of biomechanical research because in the first half of the year of my career, we were still, not to say we're not still chasing that elusive target of trying to stop structural progression. And, maybe if we just get the right biomechanical intervention, we can fix everything. It actually got really disconcerting and disheartening doing trial after trial that just gave negative results, which we did. We've done gait retraining and insoles, and I've done footwear trials. And now we're really switched to going, well, what are the tools that we've got that we can help a patient understand their condition and what they can do to manage it, and to live better with it. And I guess along that journey, it's also been thinking about maybe more of the impact that we can make as physios is more about improving function and helping people still do the meaningful things that they want to do, and less about focusing on reducing, on the pain. I think when we always chase pain as a target, it's impossible to take away pain in osteoarthritis. We can teach people to control the fluctuations perhaps and to live with it. But so I think it's been that real shift in the mindset and bringing the clinical professions along with us, but also trying to educate patients to keep up with that as well, without expecting to get a pill or a magic fix from whoever they go and see.
Yeah, that's amazing. And regarding this old type of exercise that you've been studying on, is there any specific type of exercise that we should look like with caution or more attention, or is there any type of exercise that have a better effect that you could tell us?
It's a really good question, and I think it's a really practical question because clinicians always ask this. And I think if you look at the evidence base, and I'm thinking about our research as well with the studies that we've done, but also if you look at the research with meta-analyses, really the literature shows there is no one type of exercise that is better for people with osteoarthritis than another. Probably the one thing I would say is there's not really much evidence for stretching, for example. That is something that I probably wouldn't do, because I think there's not really much evidence that it's beneficial, and it's probably not harmful, but you're probably wasting an opportunity there with a patient when you could be doing more important exercises. I think strengthening exercises are important, and there's research evidence to show that changes in muscle strength help bring about improvements in physical function. So I think particularly for clinicians who might be working with a patient where the patient wants to improve their walking, or they're having trouble getting up and down stairs or in and out of the chair, strengthening is, or a component of strengthening is important. But for many people, it might be an aerobic exercise program or a more generalized physical activity program, and there's evidence that that's beneficial as well. So I think the key thing for people is to work with the patient and work out actually what they're going to engage in, because exercise is not going to be a quick fix either. It's not like you can say, go and do these exercises for 4 weeks and then you've fixed your osteoarthritis problems for the next 5 years. We need to work with patients to find, a program that they're going to stick with and enjoy, and build that kind of mentality that exercise is going to be a long-term tool for them to help manage their condition.
Yeah, I think that actually is a good message for patients and clinicians. There's no magic bullet, like there's no better exercise, but the challenge is getting to behavior modification. So do what works for you. And I think the field has changed for that in the whole chronic pain, for all chronic pain conditions, which makes a lot of sense. And I think maybe now we know more what to do, but it's hard to do because it involves.
I think the other thing, and some of this, my reflection comes from some of the work that I've done in the telehealth space, and maybe we'll talk about that a bit later. Some of the challenge is, I think, in clinicians accepting that there's, we're often taught, and often there's lots of professional development out there to do all these really, fantastic specific exercise programs, or do this sort of fancy program. And it can be really hard to see research or be told, well, actually, it doesn't need to have fancy bells and whistles, any kind of, as long as the patient's exercising, that's a good thing. And I think sometimes it's a bit more around the clinician and their professional identity actually being willing to embrace this information, that maybe all that complicated information that maybe people were taught a while ago or heard somewhere else, it's actually not necessary for the patient, and just getting the patient working with something that they want to do. And I think the other thing is, when we're thinking about a long-term exercise approach, people need variety. You can't ask people to do the same strengthening exercises, for, forever. Maybe they do something for a while, and then maybe they'll switch to an aerobic exercise program and then switch back. I think we need to start thinking a little bit more creatively about, and teaching the person with how they can progress their program without relying on coming to a clinician every week to get a new program as well.
Yeah. And I think it makes a lot of sense. So we have now a lot of evidence for OA. I think we know how to treat this patient. How do you see the implementation of those interventions, especially maybe with the example here in Australia? Do you think patients are actually now receiving the right care for OA?
Look, it's changing slowly. I think, I don't think osteoarthritis care is any different to any other, medical condition, where we know there's, a big chunk of years between research evidence, being published and then making it into clinical practice. So, I think it's incremental and it's slow, but, and we still, and that's not to say it's perfect by any means. We've got data, and certainly we've done research here in Australia amongst general practitioners and amongst different clinicians, showing that still we're not seeing, in the ideal world, we'd be having every patient with osteoarthritis who sees a clinician being offered an exercise program. Because of course clinicians can offer it, they can't make a patient do it, but we're still not seeing, we're not up at 100%. We're getting there. We've still got overuse of surgery, we've still got overuse of drugs, but there's lots of reasons behind, it's complex, it's hard to change clinical behavior. It's not just the individual clinician, it's the system they work in, it's the funding models, it's the patient themselves. Some patients patient beliefs are really big. And I think particularly if we're physios, talking about physios, a lot of professional identity and patient expectations around physio is around hands and manual techniques and the physio doing something to me. And some patients feel ripped off if they go to a physio and the physio says, well, I want you to do an exercise program is the best thing for you. So it really is, it's a slow process, educating patients and educating clinicians, but it's changing slowly, but still not where we need it.
Cool.
Great.
Yeah. And moving into the telehealth research, I think we all agree that it's here to stay and grow even more into the healthcare. But I'd like to know just your experience here in Australia before the pandemic and after, because I don't think you had a barrier for the regulation. For example, in Brazil, when I was starting doing research in telehealth, I had to go to the council and try to change the rules for that was before the pandemic. To try to have a regulation for telehealth, but here in Australia, I think it was more advanced on that. But how do you see telehealth before the pandemic and during the pandemic and your research?
Yeah, so it's interesting. We started our telehealth research, number of years ago, well before the pandemic. And the reason was one of those implementation questions. It's like, we know there's a chunk of people who getting to a physio or a clinician, Australia's massive, right? So, and all the healthcare providers are largely clustered in, metropolitan cities. And it was like, well, what's one way we can improve access? And that's why we got interested in telehealth. And prior to the pandemic, look, it happened, I would say, in niche area. It was happening in niche areas, not really in physiotherapy. And the reason it was only in small areas, our biggest barrier was there was no funding for it. So no reimbursement model. So you couldn't get, generally you couldn't get any, there was no Medicare rebate for telehealth. If you had private health insurance cover and you had extras cover to go to the physio, well, that was fine if the physio provided it in person, but they wouldn't cover it if it was covered by telehealth. And so as I talked about before, finances are a big driver to behaviour.
Yeah.
So when it's not reimbursed, clinicians didn't offer it. And I think the other thing that's important to say is pre-COVID, it really wasn't taught a lot in most of the health professional university degrees. So if I think back to, now I'll talk mainly as a physio, with the exception probably of up in Queensland where Trevor Russell's been doing telehealth research for a long time and had probably embedded some telehealth curriculum into their course up there. Most other health professions were not learning about telehealth or how to do it. And so pretty much all the clinicians didn't really have any skills. So we were doing our research to, and one of the reasons it was also that people would go, oh, well, it's not effective. I'm a physio. I can't touch the patient. The patient would go, well, the physio can't touch me. It's not going to work. So we were focused on, building the evidence pre-pandemic. And then, of course, the pandemic came and everyone had to switch to telehealth. And that's actually been quite a good thing over here in Australia because we're starting to see some of those funding models change. So they changed on a temporary basis during the pandemic, that because everything had to be delivered, via Zoom or whatever. We had so many lockdowns down here, particularly in Melbourne. So there was temporary funding available, but some of the health funds now have made that permanent. Some of the Medicare items, for example, there are now Medicare items for GPs that I think are staying for longer, whereas previously there was really tight rules around whether that could be accessed. So we're seeing some changes in the funding model that will help keep telehealth services here to stay. And there's obviously been an explosion in research as well that's just happened since the pandemic. And I think lots of people have been forced to experience it as well. So one of the things that our research has shown is that when clinicians or patients have never had telehealth before, they're quite skeptical. They're kind of going, oh, well, all right, if I must, I'll give it a go. I don't think it's going to be that. I don't think it's going to be as good. But then we've done research in our clinical trials and with our qualitative studies, getting patients and clinicians to reflect on their experiences afterwards. And they go, well, actually, it was way better than I thought. And I was really surprised. It was really effective. And the patients, we've had patients say, it's actually better than in-person care. It feels like the person's in my house and they're not running next door to see a second patient at the same time. So I think this forced experience, this kind of forced natural experiment, if you like, is slowly going to, help change things. I think the important thing that we've always found and maintained with our research is that telehealth shouldn't be a replacement for in-person care. It should be there as another option, though, for people who can't access in-person care. And there's no rule. Right? That's right. It's another option. And there's no rule that says that it's either or. Why can't we look at blended models of care where perhaps the patient who has difficulty travelling to a clinician goes for perhaps the first visit, but then has their follow-up over telehealth because it's far more convenient, comfortable and cost-effective to do it from their own home rather than battling the traffic and driving for an hour and trying to find a car park at the clinician's office.
Yeah, that's very interesting actually, because sometimes when you talk about tele, people used to think about like now we are gonna end up with just telehealth education, and what about the touch, like hand by hand, and then they don't see it as a perspective of being another option, like opening the opening the scenario actually, then closing.
I think there's probably been a bit of fear out there, and I know certainly from the sort of the stakeholder perspective, we do quite a bit of work with private health insurers and stuff, and now I'm reflecting on pre-pandemic that one of the fears around telehealth was that opening that up for funding would see an explosion of people coming in and putting up the costs, from going this number of people having physio care to now this number. And I think that was one thing that was really good in the pandemic, because it gave the opportunity to collect lots of data about You know, how
That's
are
right.
how are people consulting, whether it's a GP, and we did quite a few surveys with allied health people. And what the data really showed was that there was just a switch, but it didn't blow up the, you know, all of a sudden these people didn't come rushing out of the woodwork to start taking up appointments that weren't having appointments before. So I think it provided some
Right.
reassurance that there wasn't going to be cost blowouts. But I think
That's
from a
right.
clinician perspective, some people think, oh, well, what if telehealth's there? Well, maybe we'll never be able to see patients in person again. I don't think that's a very realistic
Yeah.
proposition, and probably something that's unfounded, I think.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
great.
And I feel those blended models will be the future. Maybe
I think
almost
so too.
everything would be a hybrid or a blended model. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, if we have a look at, you know, all the sorts of digital health and wearables, and, you know, people are integrating apps into care, and, you know, all sorts of computerized elements, I think it will be the future of healthcare, not just in the physio profession, but across all professions and different conditions.
Yeah. Especially now with the AI development. There's a
Absolutely.
lot of AIs, and I think they'll be used a lot for the
Yep.
triage of patients. And yeah, that's something we'll be looking to. And now a little bit about the PEAK trial, the PEAK program. For those who are not familiarized, this is a fantastic project for knee osteoarthritis management, and it's also available in Portuguese now. I think Chinese and Spanish as well.
Chinese and Spanish, yep.
Yeah, I think I'll put the link in the description. There's a training. I think I've done the training maybe 5 years ago or 6 years ago. I think when you launched in the first place, maybe. So what's the latest results from the program?
Yeah, it's a
I know you're
good
doing
question.
a lot of studies. Yeah.
Yeah, so the PEAK trial, we started, it'll be pre-pandemic. It's a non-inferiority clinical trial that we, you know, developed pre-pandemic, before we had ever even heard of COVID-19. And it was basically to answer the question, and the idea for this really came from one day when I was talking with a private health insurer. We were talking about telehealth and, you know, video conferencing care. And they went, but is it as effective as in-person care? And that's what gave the idea for comparing video conferencing head-to-head with in-person physio consultations. And it's a non-inferiority trial. It's been a big trial, 394 people, I think, is the sample size that we've had to recruit over 2 states, and we've followed those patients for 9 months. And excitingly, we are just cleaning up the data, and hopefully in the next week we'll be sending it to the statistician, and we will know the outcome. We're hypothesizing that when physios deliver care via video conferencing, and by care I mean a package of care, and I can explain that in a moment, but we're saying that the video conferencing care will be non-inferior to the same care when it's delivered in person. And the outcomes that we're measuring are knee pain and physical function as the primary outcomes, but there's a whole range of secondary outcomes as well. We're looking at the distance traveled to attend appointments, time spent. We've got different a range of different clinical outcomes. There's cost effectiveness analysis built into it. And the program itself is so when I talk about the program, the PEAK program is the package of physio care that's been based on lots of our trials in the past. So it's basically 5 consultations with the physiotherapist over 3 months, and it's quite structured, but it's focused predominantly on exercise, physical activity, and education with the patient about their condition and how they can help manage it. And so the exercise program's focused on strengthening exercises, and the physical activity part is built around increasing walking and steps per day, and also helping to increase incidental activity. So what we did, and this was one of the nice things about the pandemic, we packaged it all up into an online training program and opened it up worldwide. We developed this to train our trial physios, and we had grand plans at some point in the future releasing it. But then the pandemic happened and people had heard about our training that we had. And nobody knew how to do exercise therapy over Zoom or how to do it. And so we pretty much fast tracked it and released the training. And so it's free. And as you say, Bruno, it's obviously we developed it in English, but it's since been translated into Portuguese, Spanish, and most recently Chinese.
Yeah.
So hopefully by the end of over the course of this year, I'll be able to start sharing the results. We've obviously published a range of different papers along the way, looking at the program, and looked at some qualitative work, and we've got a couple of other nested papers coming as well.
That's great. Yeah. I was about to ask you about those qualitative research, because I think you look at the acceptability of the program for the patient, for the user, for the physios. Just if you can comment on that.
Yeah. So we've done that in some of our previous trials. We've looked at that from both the patient and the physiotherapist. We've done it in a couple of trials. And we've done it from looking at it with telephone delivered care and video conferencing care. And the patients really, the really strong message that we get from patients is how convenient it is for them to be able to do, their consults from home. And how, I think the thing that really surprised us was that how personal it feels. And I think it's the concept of being in their own home. And it feels like the physio's coming to them rather than them going to a clinical environment. And I think the other really key message that came from the qualitative work, and this was reinforced by the physios as well when we interviewed them, was about how important the video conferencing was for realigning patient expectations. So we talked about at the beginning of this of our chat here about how patients often, when they turn up to a physio, they expect hands-on and the physio will do something. Well, people don't expect that when they're doing this over the Zoom screen, do they? It all of a sudden changes expectations, and the physios found that really really refreshing, because they felt like they weren't being forced by patient expectations to do things like manual therapy or things that they didn't really want to do, because they knew that it's not particularly evidence-based, but the patient asks them to do it. So they get put in this really awkward position. That was one of the really big things that came out with telehealth, and particularly from the patient saying, I felt really, really empowered. And they liked the fact that their exercise programs were prescribed for them in their home. So instead of the physio saying, oh, do this and do that and find a safe area at home, they could get their iPad or their computer, and the physio could look in the corner and go, actually, no, don't do that. Move the chair, do it this way. And so I think that empowerment for self-management really, that's one of the things that I love about telehealth with osteoarthritis, is I think it really, really gets patient expectations. If you set it up well and explain the role of physio and exercise for OA, and explain therefore why telehealth can be beneficial and why you don't necessarily need to go and get hands-on, I think it can be really quite a powerful way of consulting with patients.
Amazing. Yeah, that's just amazing. Well, Rana, as you know, this podcast is linked with the Pedro database, and so I'd like to also touch on the importance of evidence-based practice in osteoarthritis as well. So how do you see the training and the education of the next generation of professionals in incorporating evidence-based practice for managing osteoarthritis? Do you see any important changes of the years?
Yeah, look, it's a good question. I think if I'm reflecting over a longer period of time, and so now I'm thinking about like back to when I was a student, I think we're seeing, because of the changing health profile over the decades, a greater emphasis on chronic diseases in undergraduate education across, I can't speak for, the other professions, but certainly in physio. Yeah. And so I think there has been a bit of a shift from, now we're seeing that chronic diseases getting a lot more focus, and
Mhm.
therefore a
Yeah.
bit more teaching around sort of that patient-centered care and behaviour change support. However,
Mhm.
one of the challenges is, courses are getting more and more packed with information, and there's just not enough room in the curriculum to teach every student everything that we want them to know. So I don't think undergraduate programs will ever be able to necessarily teach everything as well as they could. I think there's still room for improvement.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so I think it's on us to create other learning opportunities for clinicians to supplement that base training, if you like,
Mhm.
that they get as an undergrad. And I think that's where a lot of our work has started to move towards now, is
Mhm.
recognizing that just because someone's graduated as a physiotherapist or as a dietitian, for example, that they automatically have all the knowledge that they need to manage
Mhm.
someone with osteoarthritis. Maybe they can
Right.
go out there and they can start, but then they need to build on that knowledge. And that's one of the reasons why we released the PEAK course. Within that, it's
Mhm.
a way of pulling together all that evidence, and clinicians can do it in their own time. It's free. It doesn't take too long to do some e-learning from home.
Yeah.
The other thing that I'm involved with at the moment, which the Australian government recognised that we need to upskill all health professionals in Australia in arthritis. When I say
Mhm.
arthritis, I mean OA and rheumatoid arthritis.
Yeah.
And a number of years ago, there's a large consortium of us that's led by Arthritis Australia that was able to, that applied for some federal government grant funding to
Mhm.
develop clinician training for arthritis, and
Right.
we're most of the way, we're in the phase at the moment of building this arthritis training program that's aimed to will cover RA and OA, and obviously it's being funded and developed for Australia, but it will be bigger and broader than that, where clinicians elsewhere will be able to access modules, and hopefully sometime next year I think it will be due for launch. So I think we just need to keep going with
Nice.
those initiatives, and of course adding as much as we can into
Mhm.
undergraduate degrees, but
Yeah.
there's
That's really nice.
no end of knowledge that needs to be shoved into all these courses, and there's just not enough time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's very good. It's inspiring to see your career and your achievements. And as a very well recognized woman in research, can you tell us if you faced any challenges or uncertainties being a woman that you could share with us? And if yes, how did you navigate them?
It's an interesting question, and it's one, I guess, that I've reflected on a lot. And I guess for me, probably if I think about the biggest challenges I've had, not long after I got my PhD, I got married. I think I got married and then had my first baby a couple of years after. Now, back then, when I finished my PhD, I applied for a research fellowship through the NHMRC. It's that very old scheme, but back then they had these rules that and I didn't want to change institutions from Melbourne University because I knew I was getting married and we're going to have kids, and I didn't want to be
Mhm.
relocating interstate, or in fact they encouraged you to go overseas for a couple of years, because I knew I
Mhm.
was going to need family support to bring up my kids. So you could write a case for why you should be exempt from moving. And anyway, I put my application together, and the
Mhm.
feedback I got was really strong case, but you're ineligible because you're not moving. So I really feel like that meant at
Yeah.
that point, that was really, that was quite awful to be told you're unsuccessful as a researcher. I was
Yeah.
fortunate
Yeah.
enough to get a teaching and research position at the time that was continuing. And back then, I didn't realize actually how valuable getting a tenured position would
Mhm.
be.
Yeah.
But it meant for the first 10 years of my career, I was doing a teaching and research job, which therefore then reduced my opportunities, because there just wasn't any opportunity to get a research fellowship
Right.
unless we moved away from our family supports.
That's
Um,
right.
so that's probably, so
Yeah.
I guess I just
Mhm.
made that teaching and research career work. I had maternity leave, 2 years out with maternity leave, and quite a prolonged period of part-time work to bring up my girls. In fact, I only went back to full-time work in 2018. I was part-time up until 2018. So I think that's a challenge, you know.
Yeah,
but
yeah, of course.
I think the good thing is now, you know, those rules around you must move from your research group, and I think all of that's really, you know, in the rear view mirror now here in Australia. You know, the funding rules are, you know, we're far more recognising relative to opportunity and how much that disadvantages women in particular. So but I think
recognizing maternity leave.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. But the consequences of all that stuff in the past just means there's a pipeline of, you know, women that have often dropped out, and it takes a while to, you know, build up the numbers to have the same numbers of women researchers around as we have men. I think one thing that I've always been very fortunate with, because you do hear some quite awful horror stories of how sometimes some women have been disadvantaged. I think one reason why I've never really had that is being a physiotherapist and working in a physiotherapy department at Melbourne Uni, which has traditionally been more female dominated. So I haven't had those challenges where a lot of other women researchers have been working in a more male dominated research environment. I've not had to battle those challenges. It's been really more those structural inequities, if you like. And that's what I would say, that rule around those fellowships those many years ago, that you must move because you're not going to learn anything unless you move. I mean, that really is a structural inequity that wouldn't stand today. So but you know, times change.
Yeah, which is good.
It is good.
Yeah.
But, you know.
Well, great to talk to you, Ren. I would like to thank you so much for taking your time to talk to us. And I think I just have like the last question for you.
Sure.
If you could go back in time and talk to the runner in the past, what advice would you give her? If there is any.
I think probably what I would say is, and I would say when you're 80, and it's something I say to myself now, when you're 80, you're not going to be thinking about the paper that you published 25 years ago, or thank God I got that grant, or lucky you stayed up and worked that whole weekend to write that paper. Keep a perspective and remember work-life balance, and you don't need to work. You don't need to give everything up all for work in the early days. What it's a hard one to do though.
Yeah,
I still find I have to tell myself that. So think about it. When you're 80, is this what people will remember you for?
Yeah,
that's nice.
That's very nice.
Thank you so much, Rana, for your time.
No worries.
And thank you for listening or watching the episode. Please, if you like, share with a friend and help spread your podcast. And we see you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.